So this presentation is brought to you by the good folks at Media Current. That's where I work. I love it. It's a cool company. And there's a lot of us here rolling around in Media Current tees. If you see the original bright blue, that's how you know we're Media Current, because everybody can take the free ones that are darker blue. My name is Kendall Totten, and I am a Drupal themer. As I mentioned, I work for Media Current. I also do some training. I've done some front-end site development in my time. And then I've been in the Drupal space for a little over 4 years now, and I've been doing web design for about 7. And there's my Twitter handle, starryeyes024. It's a long story. It's from college, and don't make fun of me, but if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's cool. So what we're here to talk about is all about responsive design and why it's important and how we're going to use media queries to our advantage to create a responsive website, how Omega uses a media query specifically, and how we're going to use Omega to design your site. So just a tiny bit of background, the why. Why do we even want to bother with responsive design? We all know how to build a Drupal site. We know Drupal's cool. We know we need a website, but why mobile? Well, mobile page views in May 2011, this is I think it's a world statistic, was 5.8% of all web page views. In 2012, it has almost doubled. So we're looking at, this huge increase of people using the mobile device, whether it's their phone, whether it's a tablet, to access the web in some shape or another. A lot of people in other countries, that is their only means of communication or connection to the internet. They don't have a desktop computer that they're using at home. And others, we have a computer sitting over there, but we're right here and the phone's in our hand, so we're just going to use this because that's much easier. And in the US and Western Europe, 90% of mobile subscribers have an internet-ready phone. So that means there's a good chance that somebody's looking at your site on a mobile device. So we got to make it look good, right? So how are we going to do that? So we have to transform it in some way. We can't just have them kind of pinch and zoom around and navigate like they're through a keyhole. We want to help transform their website, and we want to make our bulky website that has all this content look good on a tiny little device. So responsive web design is all about changing the layout of the site based on the width of the user screen size. And here's an example of what it means, an example of responsive design. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see this is a typical layout for a web page. You've got the header across the top, you've got 2 sidebars, and your content in the middle. In the middle, that's the tablet kind of example, where maybe we now only see one sidebar, probably the other sidebar has dropped down. Might be losing audio, sorry. The other sidebar's probably dropped down to the bottom. And then on the bottom right corner here, we've got all of the regions stacked vertically. Because again, our mobile device is very narrow, so we want to fit all that same content in, so we're just going to shapeshift it a little. So how does this magic happen? How do we make this work for our website? Well, CSS media queries are the magic wands and the powerhouse behind the Omega theme. So it allows us to kind of query the user's device and say, how big is this device? Is it 300 pixels wide? Is it maybe 700? Is it an iPad? Or maybe is it a giant widescreen monitor? So this is an example, and if code freaks you out, don't worry, because Omega, I know, is a very front-end theme, and that's why we love it. But I just wanted you to see a glimpse behind the scenes of what a media query actually looks like and what it's doing. So if you look at the top there, where it says media is a screen, so we're not going to worry about print, we're only worried about screen. And it's going to say, what's the minimum device requirement to show this particular bunch of CSS? So in the first one, it says minimum device width is 700. It has to be at least 700 pixels to show this. So this might be something that applies to only a desktop device. Whereas the bottom one is a little bit more specific. Now we're saying it has to be at least 700 pixels wide, but it can't be more than 980. So now we're targeting a very limited frame of reference here. And it has to be orientation landscape. So we're probably talking about an iPad at this point that's rotated sideways. So you can get really specific with your media queries, and you can kind of use minimum and maximum to your advantage. So what Omega does is it's already kind of done this legwork for you. It's built in the media queries so that you don't have to worry about it. So that's what we're here to talk about, right? The Omega theme. That's how we're going to make our Drupal site responsive. So Omega is not only responsive, but it is an HTML5 based theme, which is excellent because that's the way of the future of the web. And it does work off of the 960 grid system. So is anybody familiar with how the grid system works? A couple of you. Okay. We're going to walk through it a little bit because this is kind of like the bread and butter of Omega, and understanding this is pretty crucial. And it also focuses on content-first layouts. And I had somebody yesterday, we did a full day of Omega training, and they said, well, what does that even mean, content-first? Well, it means that your content is the most important part of your website, and we're talking about kind of like the content of the node, for example. Maybe the stuff in your sidebar, maybe you have a menu, maybe you have some ads and some auxiliary content. It's probably not your primary focus, though. That's kind of just like on the side. So we want to make sure that we're serving up the most important stuff at the top. So for somebody who's viewing it on a desktop device, they can kind of make sense of the page because they can see everything all at once. They can see like the big header and they know where the content is. But for mobile users, we want to make sure that that content is up at the top, that they're just seeing, the site logo, the menu, and then boom, there's the content. If they continue to scroll down, then they get that extra, maybe less important stuff. So this is the Omega theory, and I like to think of it as kind of the stacking blocks, because what Omega does is it's a mobile-first theme, which means that your mobile devices are only loading global.css. So you can see this is the bottom stacking block. That's kind of like the core platform, global CSS. So you want to put styles in that style sheet that pertain to all of your devices and specifically for your mobile. So we're going to put in things like all of our style tags for our headers, for our major, like your paragraphs, your unordered list, your ordered list, all of your input formats, things like that. All the basics, right? We're going to put that in the global CSS. Once we start growing in size, like our tablet or something, we're going to add in a default CSS layer. Default CSS is added to everything above mobile. So it includes tablets, desktop sizes, and wide desktop sizes. So in this example, you could put in things like that have a little bit more to do with the layout of the site. Maybe put in some bigger background images, because now we're seeing a little bit of background going on. Maybe we want to include some more flair, like some rounded corners and things. Whereas like on a mobile phone, you don't want to fill up your space with like too much extra padding and margins and rounded corners, because that's not important. We want to just kind of like parse that out and only focus on the content. So default CSS is a good place for that. And then beyond that, each size that you go up in Omega, you're going to tack on another style sheet. So these are more for the very specific parts of your site, or the specific parts of the layout that pertain to that particular device. So for your tablets, you might have to do a little bit of extra rearranging or configuring and nesting things. So you could put that only in the narrow CSS, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of just what I walked through here, lists out so you can kind of see, the wide version of your site is going to load all 5 style sheets based on the Omega media queries. But me personally, I thought that was a little bit like over the top. I decided, why does my wide CSS, or why does my wide version of my site need to load all 5 style sheets? If I'm going to put in a style that pertains to all of the bigger versions of my site, I just put it in default CSS. So why do I need to load in the narrow and the normal in that, when I'm viewing a wide version? So I kind of modified my style sheets a little bit, or I modified the media queries rather. I'm going to show you how to do that, so that when you're viewing a tablet size, you're getting global default narrow. When you're viewing a wide, you're getting global default wide. That prevented me from having to override a lot of the stuff that I was putting in my narrow style sheet. It kind of just like takes out some of that headache, because that's where my specific stuff was going. So what I did is I stripped out the original media queries, which are on like the basic, homepage of the Omega theme settings. And I said I wanted a minimum width of 740 pixels and a maximum width of 980 pixels. And this is an example of my narrow layout media query. You will notice if you're looking at the theme settings page that Omega is also using things like minimum device width and also minimum width. I encourage you to do your own research and decide for yourself whether or not you think that's important. It takes into account things like the sidebar of the browser and whether or not to include that, the screen width versus like what we're actually viewing in the browser. I decided that that wasn't important enough for me to worry about. So I think that you should, look, there's different articles that kind of go back and forth about whether or not you should use it. So I say go for it if you want to. But you can make your life easier by making them more specific. So what are the breakpoints exactly, and why has Omega chosen, these arbitrary numbers? Well, the narrow tablet size is 741 to 979 pixels wide, which is going to pick up iPads and a handful of other tablets out there. But when they started the Omega theme, I think it was probably a year and a half ago, there were obviously a lot less tablets out there. So this is another important thing that you should consider on your own based on your website and your target audience, or maybe your client's target audience who you're designing for. Take into account those smaller tablets that are out there now. I mean, we just had the iPad mini come out last week, so you're going to want to consider that. Although the iPad mini is using a higher pixel density ratio, so it's actually going to display things the same way that the regular iPad does. So there's a Wikipedia page, and I think I actually have a link to it on my blog post, where you can look up the pixel density ratio and the width and the height of all of the devices that are out there, and it's constantly being updated. So there's a little bit of research and legwork here. I will tell you that when you're considering these things, It's very important to make your decision early on because you're going to have headache later. If you start styling things for a narrow device and you're working off of a 700 pixel grid, and later you decide, you know, I really wanted to bump it down to 600 so I can pick up some of those smaller tablets, maybe a Kindle Fire or something like that, it's going to break some of your layout. So consider this early on. So let's talk about the layout of the Omega site, how we're going to control the entire layout now that we've got the CSS media queries under our belt. I like to think of the layout as kind of like those Russian nesting dolls where we've got, you know, boxes within boxes within boxes. So the main thing is that Omega is broken down into 3 main sections. We've got the header, the content, and the footer, which is very simple. Within those sections, we have zones. The zones are, again, we're used to seeing these kinds of terminology where you've got something like a branding zone, the header zone, the menu zone, we've got a content zone, a footer zone, things like that. Inside that is the regions. The regions are what you're going to be most concerned with because that's where you're placing your blocks. So when you're on the block page, you're going to see the list of regions that Omega has by default. And those are get a little bit more specific. So you're going to see like your sidebar first, your sidebar second, and your content region. So you can place your actual content there. Everybody knows where blocks are, right? You guys see some heads? Okay, good. Okay, so you can choose to use the blocks page or you can choose to use context, but either way you're going to see, you know, regions, the Omega regions there. But you should know that they are all totally customizable. So this is what, if you show all the blocks, or all the regions, sorry, on your Omega theme, if you show them all, you're going to see kind of a layout that looks like this. The dark color areas are representing the zones, and then the smaller, lighter boxes are representing the regions. And I think I don't even actually have, I'm missing some of the footer. There's some footer ones, an extra copyright region, but there's a lot here. So if you have a simplistic website, maybe a little bit more minimalistic design, you could go into the Omega theme and you could just disable the zones and the regions that you're not using. Get them out of your way, simplify your life a little bit, but if you need them, they're there. And if you actually have a design that's more complex than this, which happens, you can totally add custom zones and custom regions. We're going to talk about that. So each of the Omega zones can be divided up into a 24, that's incorrect, that should say 16, sorry, I thought I fixed that, 24, 16, or 12 column grid system. That's because those are easily divisible numbers and it's easy to work with. So the reason, and when I brought this up earlier, we're working off the 960 grid system, 960 being the number of pixels on a standard normal monitor that we used to use that like back in the old days when we weren't reading about responsive design. But it's still a good number to kind of like base a grid system off of. So I don't know if you can see this picture. This is a little bit light, but there's some columns. There are pink stripes going on in the background here, and that's Omega showing me where these imaginary columns exist. And that's where I'm going to place my content. So think about it like this. If your 12-column grid system is like a Lego, and we love Legos with Drupal, right? That's our favorite analogy. So think about it as like a 12-width Lego. So all those little like nubs on the Lego are each of your columns. That's how many columns you have to work with within each zone. So if my region sidebar first is 4 columns wide, and my content region is 4 columns wide, then my sidebar second can be 4 columns wide. It can't be 5 because I've only got 12 to work with. So you've got a little bit of basic math to do here, but don't worry. If you miscalculate, Omega will throw you a flag and it'll say, whoa, 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 this doesn't add up. So you have to make sure that you're working off of the same number of columns that you've got specified in your zone. So if you have kind of a complex layout or you're trying to match a mock-up maybe, you might want to work with the 24-column grid system because that's going to give you a little bit more specificity to how close you can get your regions to line up. So this is what your 12-column grid system would look like on a monitor. The columns themselves are actually getting wider. They're expanding as your site expands. Your content, the words are not getting bigger. It's flowing to fit the box that it's inside of, but the columns themselves are getting wider. So this is what it would look like on a monitor. This is what your 12-column grid layout would look like on a tablet, and this is what your 12-column grid look like on drugs. So we don't want that. So what happens on mobile? We can't squish all those columns down infinitely. We gotta have a breakpoint somewhere. What we're gonna do is we're gonna stack the regions, which is exactly what Omega does, and it just takes every region, makes it 100% width, and strips out the margins. I think we have a little tiny margin on the side. And we're just going to clear float every single region. So if anybody's used CSS, you know all about floats and how those can be a headache, but it's just going to take care of that for you. Because all the regions are floating in some way or another. They're all floating to the left and arranging themselves very nicely, but on mobile they're just going to clear and stack, just like that. So let's talk about positions versus weights. So if you've ever been in your site configuration page, and you start fussing with the weights, there's a little drop down for each region where you can kind of control, and we're used to seeing weights in the block system. That's how we order our blocks, right? So if you start messing around with the weights, you'll see that, well wait, that does change the order of things, but what about, remember we talked about we want our content to be first. We want it to be first on mobile, and we want it to be first on our desktop. So what if I have sidebars on either side of my content on the desktop, but I want the content to come first on mobile? Well, we can use position instead of weight to achieve both of our goals. If you go in and configure your zone, you can just check a little box that says, I want to use positioning for my zone, for this particular zone. And you can use that to control, so position you want to think about left to right. That's how you're positioning things on your desktop version of the page. And you're going to use weight to position things from top to bottom, just like we do with blocks if you're stacking your blocks in a sidebar. So it's the same weight system as Drupal. Here's my little barometer graphic, because that's how I think of things floating and bobbing in the water. And debugging. This is a fantastic bonus part of Omega that they didn't have to throw in, but they did because they knew we were going to be helplessly confused. So if you go into the debugging tab of your Omega page settings, you can see that there's one that says turn on debugging blocks. You can turn them on, and you can also show them by default. And then there's one that says turn on the columns or show them by default. What I typically do when I'm starting to theme is I enable both of those and I turn them off by default, because you don't always need them and they kind of get in your way more often than not. So if you hide them by default, that's a good thing, because see over here on the side, I've got a tiny little checkbox on the side of my site. They're right at my fingertips. When I'm on the home page, I can just check that box and it says show the grid or hide the grid, and it says show the debugging blocks or hide the debugging blocks. The debugging blocks are going to help you see all of the regions that are at your access and your disposal. So you can kind of visualize, well, I know I want my blocks over on the side of the page. I kind of want to put them in a sidebar region. Okay, well, there's a sidebar first. I'm going to put it in that. And when you're working on the region configurations and you're changing the position and the weight, you can see how it's reflected there before you even have any content in your site. That gives you a huge advantage. And then the columns help you to visualize, how much room you have to work with horizontally. I will give you one huge word of caution that sometimes will make you want to bang your head against the wall. Let's say you have your debugging blocks turned on. There's a nice little feature in Omega where within a zone, you can specify what the primary region is for that zone. What that means is, and I'll give you a good example, is like you typically set the content region to be the primary one for the content zone, which means if there's nothing in either sidebar, those regions collapse because there's nothing in them. The content region will expand to fill whatever space is available. That's good. So we can take advantage of that. We can show all of our content. Maybe we have a wide image or a slideshow on that particular page, so it automatically expands. If you have those debugging blocks turned on, though, that will not happen, because those blocks, even though they're hiding, they still exist. So if you're banging your head against the wall and you're like, this should be expanding, my sidebars are empty, they're not hiding, that's why. Libraries. So Omega has 3 libraries that are included. One is kind of handy called the formalized library, which evens the playing field for all of those input buttons and drop downs and things like that display differently from browser to browser. So this is just, again, a nice little advantage that they threw in there for us, a goodie, if you will, to kind of help us with CSS. So turn that on, that helps out. Media queries is kind of the secret sauce of Omega. I used to say, I don't know why you would ever disable the media queries, but I actually found out why. So if you're ever working with a client that has a very small budget, they're trying to think about the future, they know they need to consider mobile, but they don't have the budget to do it right now. They say, well, we want to build on the Omega theme, but we kind of don't want to worry about mobile right now. We don't have the time to maybe put into the testing and the QA and all those special little things for mobile, like a menu system for mobile or a slideshow that adapts. So they'll say, just build an Omega, we'll worry about the rest later. So you could do that and then just disable the media queries when it's time to go live so that it still looks like a regular website to the rest of the world, but behind the scenes, we're a little bit more future ready than we would have been otherwise. There is an equal heights JavaScript also included. So this comes in handy when you're dealing with things like in the footer, and I'm really sorry, this is dark. In the footer, let's say you have a handful of blocks across the bottom that are all sitting side by side horizontally. one of those blocks has way more content, which is completely invisible to you. But pretend you can see the text here in this test ad. I'm sorry, there's more text there. So it's actually way more content than the other two blocks. But if I have background colors on those blocks, I want them to look uniform. There used to be a name for this back in the day, back when we were still like designing in Zen, Drupal 6, where it was like I think it was called the faux columns, where if you wanted to have a background that looked like it went all the way down behind the columns that were uneven, you like tiled an image vertically behind the whole zone or whatever, because you had to pretend like there was really content there. Anyways, you don't have to worry about that anymore. So you can turn on the equal heights JavaScript library. You can say, I want to apply it to all of the regions in this zone. I want to be the same height. And the JavaScript will calculate what's the tallest one, and it'll make all the other blocks the same height. Easy. There's also, note that there's equal heights for the zone and to make all the regions the same. There's also equal heights within a region to make all the blocks the same height. So be aware that there's a difference. So typically I'm using it to turn on the regions for equal heights, but there is the option in case you should need it. The styles. The styles page, again, they made it handy and easy for us to toggle. We can turn off all the included niceties of the Omega theme. This is for the CSS purists out there that want to kind of start with a clean slate. I would encourage you to go in and turn off the style sheets and see what happens to your website when you do that. It kind of gets back to like, you know, HTML square one, where all the links are bright blue and all the text is like this big ugly serif and, you know, that kind of stuff. But the reason you do that is you want to get them out of your way because you're actually going to overwrite those anyway, probably, right? So if you're doing a very simplistic site, you're just trying to knock it out quickly, that gives you a jump start. You can just throw on some colors, some background images, and you've got a nice looking site. If you don't need them and you're customizing all this stuff anyway, turn them off so you're not overriding or having to override everything. If you do add a custom style sheet to your theme info file, which could happen on occasion, for one example, I use CSS preprocessor. Does anybody use Less or Sass? Yay, it's fun. I'm going to do a BOF later if anyone wants to join me. We can talk about it. So if you're using a preprocessor, I had an error where the preprocessor was like complaining about the fact that I had included a font. I was using a Google Web font and it was like, oh, I don't like it. So I put it in a brand new style sheet just called fonts.css, just keep it separate. So if you add a custom style sheet to your .info file, just like you've always done with any other Drupal theme, you can clear the cache, but you must come back to this tab, the Toggle Styles tab in your Omega theme, and check the box next to that brand new style sheet. Because Omega sees that it's there, but it wants you to say, I definitely want to enable this, which is it's a good thing. So we have that option. So just remember to go and do that if your styles aren't showing up. So I've talked a lot about the Omega theme and why it's so great, but it's even better with its BFFs, as I like to call them, the Delta module and the Omega Tools module. So single-handedly, Omega is pretty powerful, but you don't always want the same layout on your entire site, right? I mean, 9 times out of 10, the home page looks totally different than any other page on the site, even if you have a very small, even brochureware site. You know, your home page typically looks very different. So you're like, well, how am I going to configure some different layouts for the different pages of my site? You're going to install the Delta module. First, we're going to talk about Omega Tools, though. Omega Tools is a great accomplice for Omega Theme because it creates a sub-theming wizard for you. So what we always say in the Drupal community is don't hack core, and we get very agitated about it. Don't hack core means don't touch anything in the Drupal installation directory except for within the sites folder. You want to go to sites, all themes or modules, and do your changes there. I just want to make sure everybody knows that. And then within that, you don't want to edit your theme directory, your base theme directly. For example, if I went in and I changed a bunch of stuff in the Omega theme itself, and then Omega came out with a new update or a patch or some kind of release later, and I wanted to apply that, it would blow over all my settings and it would erase everything and I'd be really sad. So what we do instead is we create a sub-theme where we add all of our custom stuff, and then really the sub-theme is just watching the parent Omega theme and getting all of its power from there, Omega doing the legwork behind it. So Omega Tools gives you the ability to create one of these sub-themes very quickly. When you install it, enable it, at the top of your theme, your appearances page in Drupal 7, you'll now see a link that says create new sub-theme or create an Omega sub-theme. Click that box, it walks you through really quickly. You can name it, give it a description, whatever, boom, you have a sub-theme, and you can work off of that. There's also Drush integration for anybody who loves Drush. And I don't have the exact command up here, but you can Google that and find it relatively quickly for a quick Drush create sub-theme command. And then also you can easily revert and export your theme info or your theme settings page. And here's why that's really important. Omega is only going to watch either your settings page, which is where all those configuration knobs and pulleys are, or it's going to watch your .info file. The one tiny exception is if you add like a new region or zone or a CSS, it will be aware of that and it'll still watch your settings page and that's fine. But I'm talking about all the configuration for, I want my sidebar to be 4 columns wide and I want it to be below the content, all those kinds of settings, right? So I'm doing my job, I'm working on the settings page, I'm configuring everything as I want it, and I have the Omega Tools module installed. So now I have a button at the bottom of my site which says Export. I'm going to click that button and it takes me to a page where it looks very much like the theme info settings. And I'm going to actually show you a glimpse of that so you can see what I'm talking about. So I'm scrolling down to the bottom of my theme info page here, and I'm going to click Export Theme Settings. And see, here's a whole bunch of lovely code, which this would be awful if we had to write all this by hand, right? Aren't we glad that Omega does this for us? So all this code, you could do one of two things. You could copy it and paste it and put it into your theme info file directly, or you could click the Export button and it'll do it for you. One note is, if I'm going to take you to, this is what my actual theme info file looks like. You'll note that if you scroll down past all the zones and regions, here's the names of your zones and regions, and here's my custom fonts.css that I threw in there. You want to look for this line which says version equals 1.x. Everything after that is all the settings that we're copying and pasting from the site. So, there we go. So all of this stuff. So what I don't want to do is override everything above the version 1.x. This is all important. We want to keep that. We just want to export all the settings below it. So again, let Omega do the job for you and just click the export button at the bottom, you'll be fine. I just want you to know what's happening behind the scenes. There's also this checkbox at the bottom which says revert theme settings. So back to my example here, it's only watching one or the other. So when I basically take all my settings and I export them into the .info file, I now want to tell Omega, okay, stop watching the settings page, instead watch the .info file and pull off of that. The reason being, we're usually working off of like a local or development environment, and then we have a production environment, right? So we can do all of our settings and configuration locally. We want to export that .info file, and we want to put it through version control, right? That's a good thing. We want to use like Git or SVN, and we want to push it up to the local or the live environment, the production environment, and we want the production environment to only watch the .info file. And you want to encourage anybody, if there's anybody else working on your site at an administrative level, they don't want to actually edit the settings on the live site is a good best practice. You just want to pull from the .info file. So that way you can test everything on your local site first. So back to the Delta module. Delta is awesome because it allows you to make copies of your theme settings file. So all that lovely configuration stuff you did to customize the generic look and feel of your site, you can clone that, you can make some changes, and you can apply that to a different page using context. So, and then another bonus is Delta makes things like page title, breadcrumbs, your main page content. It turns all that stuff into blocks so that you can more easily move it to a different region if you need to. So let's take a look at how Delta works really quickly. Okay, so I'm back here on my theme info page, my theme settings page. And up at the top, you'll notice that there's a new tab because I have the the Delta module is installed. So I can see a Delta tab up at the top there. So what you do is you click the Delta tab and you say, I'm going to add a brand new copy of my theme settings. And I'm going to give it a name, I'm going to give it a name like, multimedia page or something like that, multimedia section, or whatever the new section is that you want to apply it to. You can give it a description if you like. And you're going to specify which sub-theme it works for, because this actually works for more than just Omega, because they're just that nice. But we're going to choose the theme TB Dog. That's the main Tampa Bay Drupal user group is where I lived last year, so I helped them out with the theme. So choose your theme that you're applying this for. And you do have the ability to set a parent template. If you have more than one Delta, they can kind of inherit from each other. We're not going to get into that too deeply, but you do have that option. And here's the important part I wanted to stress. At the bottom it says operation mode. You can choose to override only different values, or you can override all the values. So here's a good example. Usually on your site, you've got things that pretty much every page has in common. Things like the logo, your theme, or I'm sorry, your like site slogan, maybe your menu bar, and then all the things that are in your footer. But kind of the stuff in the middle is what changes. So I typically roll with only override different values, and then when I create my Delta template, I just change the things like rearranging the sidebars or moving around that content area. Anything that I don't touch, it's still going to look back to the original parent theme, my sub-theme, and it's going to go back there and find out, well, what do you want me to do with the header stuff? What do you want me to do with the footer stuff? Because I didn't change it. So it's only focusing on the differences. So you have that option at the beginning to only override the different values. I usually roll with that. It creates the template for you, and then you have a couple of options here. You want to click on Configure to actually get into the theme settings, and this is going to look identical to your Omega theme settings. They gave you a nice big label at the top here. It says, you're currently editing the Delta template multimedia, because they want you to remember, this is not your regular sub-theme. You're in a template. This is something separate. So change whatever you need to change here. If you come into the configuration and you want to move around your sidebars or something like that, change the width, and then save that. It only knows that I changed one thing. I changed the width of the sidebar. So everything else, it's still going to look back to the original sub-theme. If anyone here, though, has used Omega for quite some time, this was a bug that they have since fixed. It didn't used to do that. That was always the intended goal and what it should have been doing all along, but there was a bug. So if you ever gotten frustrated and you're like, that doesn't work, I know, I've tried. They did fix that, so that's good. Anybody have questions about, and I know I'm kind of like, I talk fast, so if anyone has questions and I'm just rushing right past it, please give me a shout out. And it's okay, I know there's a lot of people here, but you can shout. If you're thinking the question, somebody else is probably thinking it. Yeah. He said, is there any way you can export Omega theme settings in a feature versus just through the theme info export? Yeah, well, I mean, you can use the Delta templates to do that because Delta does show up in the feature list. You can export those templates. So you could choose to only use Delta templates on your entire site and never have anything just refer to the regular sub-theme. So, and Delta totally rolls through features easily. So one other thing that I did want to point out is, so if you have these Delta templates created, and I mentioned you can apply them with context, that is a separate module that you must install. And if you click on structure, that's where it falls. What you can do with context is it's basically a big if-then statement. If you add a new context, you can specify a condition. You can say, like, if the path is the front page of my website, then apply a Delta template, or then change around the blocks to look like this. So you can say a condition like path. You could also specify maybe a user role, a taxonomy term, content type, etc. So I'm going to just choose path, and we'll do front. And then a reaction, you'll see Delta listed as a reaction if you have that installed, sorry. And then it'll show any templates that you already have created. So you definitely want to create the template first, and then go into your context and apply that template here. And you can toggle back and forth. So some generic tips for responsive design. I always encourage people to make a mobile and tablet wireframe at the bare minimum. If you can make a mock-up, that's excellent, but at least make a wireframe ahead of time so you can kind of visualize how all your content is going to look on a smaller device. If you're here today, you have the advantage of knowing kind of how Omega works and how the regions work and zones and things like that. So you have an advantage when you're creating a wireframe so that you don't kind of commit the cardinal sin, as I call it, of region jumping, where I've had people say, well, okay, I want to have the block like way in the footer on my mobile site, and like in the footer that's like a totally different color and totally different section, but over on my regular desktop, I want to put it like up in the header and in the user bar. And I'm like, okay, those are very drastically different changes. We're still operating under, everything needs to be in the same zone. It's similar. And not to say that you couldn't do that. You absolutely could. What you do is you would have to print the block twice, and you'd have to hide and show it in whichever condition you want to show it on. But that adds bloat to our code. Now we're expanding the DOM, making it a lot bigger than it needs to be. So you want to be aware of the regions. And you want to theme the mobile side first. When you start actually sitting down and writing your CSS, start with your global style sheet and get all of the good stuff out of the way, all of the styles for the text, some basic image styles. Like I always throw in image max width is 100% and height is auto. That's going to help you right off the bat because it's automatically going to scale your images to fit whatever region they're in. That's not the final solution though, so I don't think that's all you have to do for images. I encourage you to look into things like the Adaptive Images module, and I've got a link for that so you can find it. There's a client-side Adaptive Images module, things like that, that are actually going to create smaller cached versions of the images so that your mobile devices aren't loading a 1200 pixel wide image. That's bad. But this is going to help you to theme quickly, get off the ground running. So theme your global stuff first. Actually, there's a module out there called Style Guide. Has anyone heard of this? It's a good module. It does one thing and it does it very well. She's heard of it. You install it and you turn it on and it adds a page to, I think it's your theme settings. You can get to a link there, view the style guide page. It's just a nice big node full of every kind of text that you could imagine. All of your headers, all of your unordered lists and ordered lists and input formats and whatever, so that you can theme all of that good stuff in your global CSS first. Then worry about the layout part. And put that in default CSS or narrow or wherever you need to put it. And also don't put large background images in global CSS because that's going to load on your mobile. You can use things like CSS3 to create background gradients. You can create background textures even with CSS3 now. And if you didn't know, there's a cool way to create, I'll probably add a link to this after the fact. There's a way that you can take a small, little thumbnail image maybe that you're going to tile for a texture. You can actually just turn it into a chunk of code and put it in your CSS. So the image doesn't even have to exist. You don't even have to make that request and pull an image to the mobile phone. It just builds it on the fly in the CSS. So I'll add that link for you later. If you're designing in Photoshop, which a lot of us still do that, there is an excellent plugin out there called Guide, which makes your life a lot easier when you're trying to design for something like the Omega theme, where we're working on a grid system. Because nobody likes to stand there and drag all those rule lines across the page and calculate them out. That's a bear. So the Guide plugin, it allows you to say how many columns you want, how wide they should be, how big the margin is in between them, and how many of them, and something else, whatever. There's a fourth setting. So you can set up these little these settings for each style of the Omega grid system. So the 24-column grid, the 16-column grid, and the 12-column grid. I've just got these hanging out, and all I got to do is check a button, and then I can clear all the guides, and I can go to the new column grid system and see how that applies. So again, if you have a 24-column grid system, you're going to have more flexibility for how you can align things on your grid system. Also, don't forget to consider there are many ways to implement a mobile-friendly menu, and I have a blog post on this recently where I kind of covered, there's a lot of blog posts out there that talk about all the menu options, so I didn't go into detail on that. But one thing I found myself doing, we actually do it on the Drupal Camp Atlanta site. When you collapse the page, you just see a little menu link up at the top, which shows and hides the menu. And this is the tiniest bit of jQuery, but it's huge, because if you were loading the site and you had to scroll past this menu every single time, and chances are you'd probably accidentally hit a link as you were trying to scroll by, that would get old really fast. So we just kind of collapsed the menu to get it out of the way quickly. And so a coworker of mine helped me write the code for this. And what we did is we just took that little chunk of JavaScript and we put it into a module. So when you turn that on your site, it does two things. It adds a little block for you called the mobile menu toggle, which is just that one link that says menu. And you can put that anywhere you want on your site. I recommend something like the header or the branding region, anywhere except for the mobile region or the menu region. And then it's going to show and hide the mobile zone. So put your menu in the menu zone, put your mobile toggle link into the header zone, and then it'll work exactly like this. So it's kind of like a two-step process. We do have to update the documentation a little bit. And it is still a sandbox module, but it's still very usable. So please use it, give us some feedback. If you have bugs or whatever, let us know. That would be cool. It's called the mobile menu toggle, maybe? I don't know. This link, this will take you to the blog page, and there's a link in there to try it out. So it's experimental, but please give us feedback, and we'd love to make it better. CSS3Pi stands for Progressive Internet Explorer. This is a handy little tool that I like to mention because it makes my life better. And it's actually so good that in Omega 4 version that's probably going to roll out sometime early next year, we hope, they've chosen to include this script inside of it. And it's not a JavaScript file, it's actually an HTC extension, whatever that is. What it does is it tells Internet Explorer versions that are much older, i.e. 7 and 8 or whatever, how to interpret border radius box shadow, linear gradients, all those lovely things that we love to use, but we can't because we hate IE. So if you download this, or you download this little script and you use that on your site, now you can use CSS to do a lot of your styles instead of loading images, which is all very mobile friendly. And then I have a couple lists here of resources, and so this is not something I expect you to jot down. Just grab the slides afterwards, and you can grab these. And so a couple of things, like I mentioned, the CS adaptive images, the adaptive images modules themselves will help you create cached versions of images. Something like Flex Slider is great for a responsive slideshow, because you have to consider all these little pieces of your site that were just so easy to plug in before. Well, now they have to like squish, right? So don't forget. And then here's a whole bunch of lists of testing. There's some like Sauce Labs is good for device testing. There's one called MobaTest. CanIUse.com will help you figure out what kinds of CSS3 you can use depending on, you know, if you have a lot of users still using IE7. I'm sorry. And then, oh, actually, I wanted to go back. Dang. Okay, the last one here. Adobe has a tool out there called Edge Inspect, which is free, because Adobe's moving all of their products up to the cloud, and you can create a cloud subscription now and like subscribe to Photoshop, which is cool. But the Edge Inspect is a tool that you plug into your browser, you install a little app on your desktop, you install the app on your phone, and it connects your phone to your desktop if you're on the same Wi-Fi network. So I can be looking at the web page. What happens is you load a web page on your desktop. That same web page loads into the app on your phone, so you can see it there, see how it looks on your mobile phone. Then you can inspect the element the same way you do with Web Inspector on your browser on your phone. So you can actually debug it much quicker and easier instead of just going, it's broken, I don't know why, go, you know, review the margins 20 times and hope that something irons out. And so yeah, so I know, again, I talk really fast, but if you have questions, please let me know and I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah. That's a good question. He asked, what's the advantage of basically using the Omega theme versus something like the Twitter Bootstrap? Someone mentioned that to me yesterday, and I guess it's a very lean way to build a responsive site. I guess it kind of comes down to the site builder's preference. I prefer to work where I have a front-end interface where I can see everything. There's no chance that I can make a mistake by leaving off a semicolon or breaking the code somehow and having to spend a lot of time debugging code because it's all just switches, right? So I can take those switches, I can export them into code. I also think it's easier to tear away things that I don't need than to build it from scratch. I don't like to reinvent the wheel. So for me, Omega is like, I get this huge springboard where I get a great starting point. I can configure quickly. I can throw away stuff that I don't need. It's just as fast for me than to start with code. But that's my personality type and the way that I prefer. Someone who's very comfortable in code and prefers that, and they don't want to be on some people call it a clunky interface. So that it's just a preference really. And I've heard kind of discussions about like performance issues for both. And we haven't really seen any concrete proof that something like Omega is going to add a lot of bloat to your code or whatever, because really it's the interface that's helping you as the themer and the site builder. It's not going to add time to the end user. And you can pull out things like there's container wrappers that you can tell Omega I don't need those. You can turn off the stuff that you don't need. So I feel like it's really just a springboard for you. Anybody else? Yeah. That's a good question. He said, does Omega have any resources for working with SAS? I guess they're sort of like two different tools. SAS being a preprocessor that helps you write more efficient CSS, and Omega 4 is actually building on SAS. What they're trying to do is use SAS variables to create custom grids, so we're not just limited to 12, 16, and 12 column grid systems. So they've definitely recognized that SAS is really powerful, and they're trying to like build off of that. But it's really up to you as a site designer to use something like SAS or less. I've done both, and there's not a lot of complexity on the Omega side. I simply just copy all the Omega style sheets and create a less version or a SAS version, and I work in those files alone. When I save the file, I have a compiler on my desktop that changes it into CSS, and then I just use those. I mean, that's what the site is looking at. I do commit my SAS and my LESS files. Also, I want to have a backup, and I want my team to be able to edit it if they need to. So I pass those through version control, but the site doesn't know or care that they're there. They're just helping me write code more efficiently. So I would encourage you to check it out if you haven't used those. There's like the smallest learning curve, but once you get the hang of it, you're like, I can't believe I didn't do this years ago. Like, and I did start using LESS originally, and I've kind of moved over to the SAS camp because I feel like it's more powerful, a little bit more streamlined, but it's up to you. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah. And again, these are all on bit.ly/omega-training. You can download the slides and get all those links. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, that's a question. You guys are a quiet bunch. I had more questions in my group of like 10 people yesterday at the training. Does anybody like, this makes way more sense now, like when you were struggling before, now you kind of like get the generic layout of Omega and how this is going to work? Can you give me a cheer if you're excited about it now? Yay, thanks. All right, well, rock and roll. Thanks.